A few years ago, Richard Reeves wanted to write a book, but initially nobody would publish it, even though he was writing about an issue that directly or indirectly affects every single American.
And a growing number of men who I think to some extent feel like they're not clear that they are needed. They're not clear what their role is in society. And for all of the bad things about the old, much more patriarchal society, which I'm not suggesting for a moment we go back to, men did know their place. The problem is that women also knew their place, and it was subservient to men, right? But people did know their place in that society, and what we've done is we've replaced that world with one where women are being encouraged to expand their roles and rise up, and I am here for that 100%. But it's raised this question about the place of men, and we've almost been embarrassed to ask it for fear that will make us sound like closet misogynists.
What can be perplexing about this issue is what Reeves calls the apex problem. So the people we see, the people at the top, they're mostly men. Most CEOs are men, every single president we've had, many of the richest people are men. But, he says, that should not obscure the bigger picture.
Some of this debate about gender equality has a very, very elitist feel to me. It's about boardrooms. And that's incredibly important. I don't want to say it's not important. But it is not where the overwhelming majority of people live. Do we need to do more for women's representation and leadership? Hell yeah. Can we also worry about the fact that we're losing 40,000 men a year to suicide now?
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, let's pay ourselves the compliment of thinking we can think both of those things are a problem.
Democrats particularly may have to do a better job of understanding what men are dealing with if they want to win them back. In 2024, President Trump won men by an impressive margin, about 12 points.
I was very struck by how many Democrats were saying in the run-up to the 24 election, why are young men moving towards the right? And I would always correct them and say, are you sure that they're not moving away from the left? It's much easier to say, what is it about the right? Is it Trump? They're all becoming misogynists, which they do not appear to be, right? Their views have not really shifted on policy or politics. Like, are you quite sure that they're not being turned off by you as much as they are being turned on by the Republicans?
Welcome to It Turns Out. I'm Kara Miller. Richard Reeves is the author of Boys and Men. He's also the founding president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, and he's a senior fellow at Brookings. And he says the issues that men and boys face, they've had trouble getting attention from politicians and from the press.
I think it goes against the grain, and I understand why the grain is the way it is. And there are many gaps that still do, in fact, go the way. When we think about a gender gap, we typically think about the ways in which women and girls are behind boys and men, and there are plenty of them, as I don't need to tell you. So it goes against the grain, but I do think that there's just a psychological issue with saying, well, yeah, but sometimes there are gender gaps that go the other way.
Go back, for example, to the early days of the pandemic and to an announcement that came from the government.
The release came out from the education department on the impact on college enrollment. And the college enrollment rate for men dropped 7 times more than for women in that initial impact of the pandemic. It didn't really drop that much for women, but it dropped 7-fold. And
it's like a breathtaking number. You have to keep thinking about it again and again to think, what? How is this possible?
7 times more. And I ran around, I was at the Brookings Institution, I ran around colleagues who work on the issue saying, did you know this? And they're like, no, I didn't know that. And that's interesting.
Meanwhile, men were dying from COVID at higher rates. And to Reeves, the fact that these issues just weren't talked about that much, that itself was telling. In 2021, President Biden put together a White House Gender Policy Council, which put out a national strategy. Now, that strategy could have mentioned that boys had fallen behind in K-12 education and in higher education. It could have mentioned that millions of working-age men were missing from the labor force. It could have mentioned that men died deaths of despair, so suicide and overdoses, at far higher rates than women. It could have.
But it didn't. It absolutely was one-sided, and it's just a huge missed opportunity. And yeah, I do think it's emblematic of a problem on the left of the political spectrum of really seeing gender as just entirely about women and girls, and gender equality only ever meaning the inequalities where women and girls are behind boys and men. So if you try and invite them and say, well, you know that there's a bigger gender gap on college campuses today than there was in the 1970s when we passed
but the other way.
But the other way around.
Yeah.
Like, is that a gender gap you're going to care about? Oh, no.
Right.
No. And so the problem with that is it creates this sense, not least among men, that the entire gender equality movement is focused solely on the ways in which women and girls are disadvantaged compared to boys and men, and never the other way around. And it's created a really big gap in our policy making and our sensibility. And I think it has also left quite a few men wondering where they sit in this, right? And I think that has created a distortion. So it was a massively missed opportunity. Of course, when the Trump administration came in, they just abolished the Gender Policy Council outright. Right. I was pleading with both sides to have a gender policy council that did gender policy both ways. But as it turns out, such is the polarization around this debate, that it was either going to be a gender policy council that was only focused on women and girls, or we weren't going to have one at all, because this whole gender thing is a bunch of woke nonsense that we want to get rid of. And so it was a spectacular policy failure on my part, but who knows what the future will bring.
One of the big picture numbers that has been very striking to me, and I mean, sometimes it'll get a headline here and there, but often it doesn't because it's kind of a slow-moving thing, is that when you look kind of post-World War II, like about 1950, something close to 90% of like working age, prime age men were in the labor force. By 2024, that was down to 70%. And 70% doesn't seem low, but it is kind of low. It means millions of people, millions of prime age men are missing from the labor force. I wonder how you explain that slide from 90-ish% to 70-ish%, and whether that strikes you as a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal, because you're right that against that starting position, that's what, an additional 7 million men or something. And so these are not small absolute numbers, the result. And then secondly, because when you look as to the reasons why, the reasons why aren't encouraging. Now, because I think we should say that you could imagine a world where the reason for that is because men are doing much more of the work of raising children.
Yes.
Right? So women's labour force participation has gone up, men's has gone down, but that's because of this redistribution of work in the home. And if that had been the reason, I think you might feel very differently about it. But it isn't the reason. These men are not, by and large, not in the labour force because they've taken on caring responsibilities. There has been some of that, but it's largely because they are unemployed, they're not seeking work, or they've got some health problems, etc. And so these are men who are in trouble. These are men who are not only feeling in some ways surplus maybe to the labour market, but have lost the anchors of work as well as family and other parts of their lives. So these are men who are really disengaged, not just economically, but also socially too. So that statistic that you started with is the sort of thing that economists worry about. But behind that statistic is actually, I think, a really massive cultural shift, which has meant that many men have ended up feeling somewhat lost, somewhat disengaged, and that has caused massive problems in our society.
I think one perplexing part of that that maybe you can explain is, well, first of all, for years, we've had a pretty low unemployment rate, like in the 4 range. So, when you think about this issue of like men being unemployed, it's unclear exactly why this is. The other piece of information that strikes me is that both President Biden and President Trump have really tried to focus on the kinds of jobs you associate more with men, right? Like shovel-ready projects, like let's build more infrastructure, let's bring more manufacturing back to America. I'm sure some women do these things, but I think a lot of men, help build new highways and work and So explain to me how this could be given the backdrop of like most people have jobs and there's been an emphasis on primarily male jobs.
Yeah, well, there's 2 things there. One is that the very technical sounding point that an increasing share of the men who are not in the labour force are not unemployed. They're non-employed. In other words, they're not seeking work. And so it's a difference and that's a really important difference, because it's not just that these are men who like really want a job, they're looking for a job, but the jobs aren't there. There's actually men who've actually disengaged from the labour market. So the unemployment rate is obviously valuable in one way, but it's less valuable as an indicator of what's going on. Because to be unemployed, you have to be seeking work. And particularly among young men, a much bigger share of this group that's called NEETs. NEET stands for not in education, employment, or training. An increasing share of young men who are NEET, and it's about 1 in 10 young men who are now in that category. They're not unemployed. They're not seeking work. So that's the first point. The second point is that, look, for all of the rhetoric around those kinds of jobs that you've just mentioned, you can't actually jawbone factory jobs into existence. You can actually, to some extent, invest in construction jobs, and the infrastructure bill did actually create a lot of jobs for working class men. But the big picture here is that just a long-term decline away from those traditionally male jobs. Right, those traditionally heavy industry jobs. That is not going to change. It didn't change under President Trump. It didn't change under President Biden. And so they can give as many speeches as they like, but the jobs are coming from healthcare, not from factories. To put it very, very simplistically, that you can't change that from the presidential podium.
When you talk about men not being unemployed, but being like not employed, like not seeking employment, is that by choice? People are like, I just don't want to work, or is it more like they've given up? They just don't think that there's a place in this labor market for them. What's going on?
Yeah, this is where economics meets culture, and it meets psychology, and it meets mental health, and it meets, I think, these deeper questions that we might get to. Whereas if you look at men without a college degree who are not in the labor force, half of them say it's because of a health issue. They're disabled in some way, or they've got a physical or mental health issue. Half of them. And so if you just think about that for a moment, say, okay, and that is where we've seen the biggest decline in labor force participation is among men without a college degree. And if half of them are saying it's because I'm too sick to work, what does that mean? And if you dig into those numbers, what you'll see is a lot more issues around substance abuse, mental health issues, and some physical health issues too. But it's that these men are really struggling to keep themselves engaged, to keep themselves healthy. And half of them don't have kids living in the household if they're in their 30s and 40s now as well. And so what's behind a lot of these statistics is something that's really hard to quantify, but I'd almost describe as the deinstitutionalization of adult male life for many men. If you think about the four, Catherine Eden and others have done work, you look at the four big anchors of male identity, and it's kind of work, family, community, faith. And you've seen declining enrollment in all of those areas for men. What happens is you're just unanchored, and then of course you get these downward spirals. So if you're out of work, you're less healthy. If you don't have family to look after, you're less inclined to work, which makes you less healthy. And so I just think there's something I end up calling it a malaise. Just something of it's a sense of it's not just about the economy or about the education system, but it's actually a growing number of men who I think to some extent feel like they're not clear that they are needed.
Yeah.
They're not clear what their role is in society. And for all of the bad things about the old, much more patriarchal society, which I'm not suggesting for a moment we go back to, men did know their place. The problem is that women also knew their place, and it was subservient to men, right? But people did know their place in that society. And what we've done is we've replaced that world with one where women are being encouraged to expand their roles and rise up, and I am here for that 100%. But it's raised this question about the place of men, and we've almost been embarrassed to ask it for fear that will make us sound like closet misogynists. But that failure to ask and address that question has created a very dangerous vacuum in our communities and in our culture, and maybe even in our politics.
Maybe this question goes to the question of which men are falling behind, but to sort of follow up on that, Biden sort of missed opportunity in some ways, at least maybe as you see it. The tricky part, of course, is that, when you look at who has ever been president of the United States, right? No women. Who is in corporate boardrooms? I actually looked this up. When you look at Fortune 500 companies, actually 2024 was I think a banner year for women, but they hit like 10%.
10%.
Of
that's what counts as a banner year.
CEOs.
That's the banner year.
Exactly.
Yep.
So like 90% is like the worst men have ever done. I think it might be 89 point something.
That's right.
But so I think the tricky thing is to hold these two thoughts in your mind at the same time, right? These gaps that we've been talking about with men, and the reality that when you look out at like who are the most powerful people in the country, who are the richest people, like they're men mostly. maybe you can talk about that and try to square it for me.
Yeah, sometimes that's referred to as the apex problem, which is if you look at the apex of society, you still see these very strong gender gaps that you've just described. And it's clear that in many of those areas, there is an urgent moral need and policy priority to increase the share of women. I mean, you just mentioned 10%. Now, 10% is 10 percentage points more than the share of women who were in those roles just 20, 30 years ago. So it is remarkable progress from the lowest base possible. And just below that level, we have seen really big increases in the share of women in boardrooms and in senior management roles. And so there has been real progress there. I do want to emphasize that. But it doesn't mean that it is mission accomplished. And I actually had the great privilege of having a conversation with Gloria Steinem recently, which we've just published. And she raised again this issue of there not being a woman president. And Gloria's 90 now, and it's just like if there was one thing I could wish for while Gloria Steinem's still with us, it would be to have a woman president. And she, like me, is very angry at the idea that somehow or other that America can't elect a woman. So yes, but below that level, it's just much less clear that we're living in a patriarchy. Right? When 40% of women are earning more than the typical man now, which is great. But that was only 13% in 1979. So it's a transformation in the relative economic position of boys. 40% of breadwinners are women now. Great. Many of those are single mothers, so you could maybe say not so great. But the point being that just like we've made this huge economic progress for women. And so for working class men especially, and for men who aren't in the boardrooms, who aren't CEOs, they're not presidents, right? They're like men in the middle or the lower half of the income distribution, is just not clear that they can't be having real problems. And there's a problem here. There's that famous line from Sheryl Sandberg, about leaning in.
Right.
And I sometimes fear that we're so busy leaning in that we forget to sort of look around and look down. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but just like some of this debate about gender equality has a very, very elitist feel to me. It's about boardrooms. And that's incredibly important. I don't want to say it's not important. But it is not where the overwhelming majority of people live. And so we kind of miss the fact that actually many of the statistics you mentioned earlier around suicide, deaths of despair, etc., have just disproportionately hit men who don't have that much economic power. And again, if we can do both things at once, we can say, do we need to do more for women's representation and leadership? Hell yeah. Can we also worry about the fact that we're losing 40,000 men a year to suicide now?
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, let's pay ourselves the compliment of thinking we can think both of those things are a problem.
Is your sense that when you think about, let's say you look at school and boys, are the richest boys, like the top 10, people coming from the top 10% of families, are they subject to the same kinds of issues that we've talked about? Or are they, we think about like the K-shaped economy. Are they like on a completely different trajectory than most men? Does class insulate you here? Yeah,
class is a huge factor here, and it's one of the cross-cutting themes of my work, as is race, particularly for black boys and men that we discussed a bit earlier. Right. Yeah, so what you find is that the gender gaps in education, for example, just get narrower and narrower as you go up the class distribution. Now, they don't disappear. Like even in the richest households and neighborhoods, the girls are doing better than the boys.
Okay.
But that gap is much narrower than in the poorest neighborhoods. In the poorest neighborhoods, you see very big gaps. And of course, you see very big gaps between the poor neighborhoods and the rich neighborhoods. Right? And so the gender gaps don't trump the class gaps, but the class gaps don't trump the gender gaps either. They do still remain. One of the most interesting studies that I ended up arguing with a colleague about showed that parents with college degrees and high incomes were spending more time helping their sons with their schoolwork than their daughters. They were investing more time. And so this colleague of mine showed me this paper. And so see the patriarchy, parents still care more about their son's education. And I said to her, I said, I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is that the parents realize their sons need more help.
Right.
And so I can't prove this, but my thought is that in a well-resourced household, parents can actually do a lot to insulate their sons, especially from some of the ways they might struggle in the education system, right? So, and I think that helps to narrow the gender gap. So I think parents are not helping their sons with their homework more than their daughters because they care more about their son's education. I
Right.
think it's because they
Right.
think their daughter's going to do the homework anyway.
Right.
And they're
Right.
not wrong about that. It just means they can,
Right.
whereas in a struggling household, like maybe no parent is able to take the time to wonder who's doing anyone's doing any homework. And so
Right.
that might be one reason why the gender gap is less striking at the top.
One thing that is perplexing to me is, while I understand that, manufacturing has declined a lot and some of these like traditionally male jobs, and yes, men feel a little bit more unmoored in that way. When you look at K through 12 education, is it that boys are now where boys are definitely underperforming girls, no question about it. Like all the stats tell us that. Is that, were boys always underperforming girls? Like if we went back to 1960, would that have been true? And if it's not true, why are kids doing any differently? Like they don't need a manufacturing job.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not like suddenly our biology's changed, right, in the last 40
Right.
years. So
Right.
it is, the way what I think has happened is that we've leveled the playing field in education. And maybe even made it a little bit more female friendly than male friendly. And girls are better performers. And the reason we couldn't see that before was because girls were not encouraged to go on into higher education or do better. And so it's actually one of the most interesting facts I discovered is that girls had a slightly higher high school GPA than boys in the 1950s. And maybe even earlier than that. So girls have always done better than boys in school.
Oh, that's
right?
interesting.
And it is interesting because you think, well, actually, nobody in the 1950s was saying to these girls, get a great GPA so you can go to a great college and become a lawyer. Right? Or
Right.
very
It
few
wasn't going to happen.
Wasn't going to happen. So
No.
even without that motivation, even without that sort of positive pressure that girls, they were still doing better. And my interpretation of that is that girls were a little bit stronger all along. We just couldn't see that because of sexism. Now that we've largely removed the barriers to that educational success for girls and women, their natural advantages are showing up. And one of those natural advantages is they mature earlier, so they're just older. Again, this is not breaking news to any parent out there, but the average 15-year-old girl is older than the average 15-year-old boy.
Right.
She just is, right? And so that's now showing up in the education system in a way that it wasn't before. I do also think it's worth saying that the education system has probably skewed a little bit more female-friendly in recent decades. And one way it's done that is just in the cratering share of male teachers. So back in the 1980s, 33% of K-12 teachers were male. It's now 23%. It's a 10 percentage point drop. And so education itself has just become a much more female-coded endeavor. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we see boys struggling more. So it's a combination of those factors, I think. And it is quite clear right now that our education system is serving girls better than boys, and that should be seen as a problem in just the same way that it was seen as a problem when it was the other way around.
It doesn't seem like that is about to change anytime soon, though I agree that, as you say, like women are overwhelmingly teachers, K through 12, in this country. There's no reason that should be. It probably isn't the best thing. It's probably not optimal. But my reading of the data is that for men, the wage hit when you choose to be an educator is something like more than 30%. And there's a wage hit for women too. It's a little bit less because women just make a little bit less money. But that I think the teacher pipeline in general is in trouble, but the male teacher pipeline is in particular trouble. It doesn't seem like something that's turning around, though you make a very good point that it ought to.
Well, actually, I'm very pleased that my institute is incubating a new male educator network led by my colleague Curtis Valentine, specifically to work on this challenge. It's not turning around, but it won't turn around on its own. It takes intention, it takes effort, it takes investment. I mean, we didn't increase the share of women in engineering just by saying, wouldn't it be great to have more women in engineering? They had significant, there's a society of women in engineering. There's investments from government, from philanthropy, from engineering. Right? It doesn't happen by itself. If you're trying to go against the grain, if you're trying to make representation work, you have to work at it. And so we have to move beyond saying this is a problem to actually doing something about it. And that's a big part of my agenda now. Pay is part of it, for sure. There's no question that there's a bit more pay sensitivity. And so one good thing is that if we increase teacher pay, that's just good for everybody, but it should also help us to attract more men into the profession as well. And so that should be seen as a win-win.
One of the really interesting things, we talked about how girls and women tend to be ahead. Certainly by the time you get to high school, you look at like the top 10% of high school classes, it's 2-to-1. Girls to boys. And it's true, again, in college. It's like 60-40 now, women to men in terms of like who is going to college. I was looking at some stats, which you may have seen. They were out not that long ago about Brown University. Their applicant pool in 2024, about 30,000 women applied, about 20,000 men applied. Now, interestingly, when these schools create their classes, they're almost always 50-50. So these schools, for quite reasonable reasons, are rejiggering things so that despite the fact that 50% more women applied than men, it'll basically be a 1-to-1 at the end of the day. What do you think of that?
It's clear, the data's clear here, that even at these fairly elite levels, so this echoes a bit the conversation we had a moment ago, that boys are so far behind girls that in order to get an equal outcome, you have to discriminate in favor of the men. So there is a thumb on the scale in favor of male applicants to private undergraduate colleges. That is an open secret in these colleges, and I suspect it won't last for very much longer. And it's, I think, the way I think about this largely is like, what does it tell us that is something that they feel they have to do if they're going to sustain something like 50-50? There's also a nice historical irony here, which is that the only reason they are able to do that is because of Title IX. Title IX had a carve-out for private undergraduate admissions and allows them to discriminate on the basis of sex. That was to protect the single-sex schools. We couldn't have Wellesley or Smith if you couldn't discriminate. And so it was a carve-out. Someone realized at the last minute, oh, wait, we have to allow them to do that, but it's only private undergraduate. So none of the publics are 50-50 because they can't do it, right? So there's this very odd historical reason for it. And so I think it is a symptom of the fact that, like, actually it tells you how much weaker the boys are on average than the girls, that they're having to do this positive discrimination. It's very I put me in a difficult spot because I'm working on behalf of boys and men. This is a policy instituted by Brown and others that helps men, but which I think on principle, it's hard to be in favor of. I think you've got to say, look, what do you say to the woman who didn't get in because a somewhat less qualified man did get in? I think that's as hard to justify as it would be on other grounds as well. And so I actually think it's time to say, look, maybe we should look harder at how we got to this situation where we needed this positive discrimination in favor of men rather than actually putting that thumb on the scale for them.
And one of your big solutions is redshirting, right? Like basically having boys start school a year later than girls. Why? Because
boys are younger than girls. Now I know it's a bit of an odd thing to say, but on average, they're younger. They develop a little bit later. And so 5-year-old boys are younger than 5-year-old girls, and 15-year-old boys are younger than 15-year-old girls. And those do seem to be the two ages where you really see the biggest gaps, by the way. It seems to be in those kind of early years, kindergarten, pre-K, where girls they just seem to be ahead in terms of language acquisition, and particularly in terms of social skills as well. This kind of ability to kind of conduct themselves socially in an educational environment. They're just ahead. And then you see it again in adolescence because girls hit puberty earlier than boys, and that triggers all kinds of development, particularly in the frontal cortex, which there's a long technical explanation for what it does, but the way I think of it is it's the bit of your brain that makes you do your chemistry homework. Right?
When you don't necessarily want to.
When you definitely don't want to. And that develops about a year earlier in girls. And I think that explains why you see these huge gaps in GPA that aren't really the same in standardized tests, because it's not that girls are smarter than boys, or the other way around, in case that still needs to be added, but they are more organized, they're more mature. They've developed these soft skills, whatever you want to call them, around organization, deferring gratification. And that's because they're just older. They just get there faster. And that's just a fact. And it's a biological fact. And it seems to me that it's odd that it's an obvious biological fact that we don't take into account in our education policy. And one solution to that would be to give the boys an extra year, the gift of time. And that would have the effect of somewhat leveling the playing field, actually, because, as I said, a 14-year-old boy is going to be maybe about the same on average as a 15-year-old girl. So, sorry, the other way around. The boy needs to be about a year older. It's one of those interesting things where, I'll be honest about this. The data on this is not clear. The evidence on this is mixed.
Okay.
So if you go to social scientists, they'll be like, I'm not sure. Every teacher you mention it to goes, oh, hell yeah, definitely. So like,
that would be better.
It's a different data point, I know.
One of the fascinating pieces of sort of evidence you've got in your book is that you write about this program. It's in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And this program is basically, if you go through the Kalamazoo public schools, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you can go to public university or college in Michigan free of charge, right?
Completely free. Yeah, completely free. Every dollar covered. Yeah.
Right. And this program in many ways has been a big success. Like, you've got people coming out of it, going to college for free. Wow, this is great. And it was great for girls. And it didn't do a darn thing for boys in general, on average. How is that possible?
Well, it's a massive difference too. I mean, it's like a 50% increase in college completion for young women, which is massive. I mean, that's huge. Like, you don't get policy interventions like that very often. And it was zero for boys, which meant that the return on investment was negative for boys. And so it was astonishing, actually. And then I saw that, and then I started reading other studies which find some similar things. Sometimes you get these interventions, they really work much better for the women and girls. So I actually ended up getting on a plane to Kalamazoo. The researchers there are very good. Just talking to a bunch of the guys who dropped out or who decided not to take it, and it did seem to come down to the fact that it's not about the money. It's about, are you ready for college? Do you want to go to college? Does college seem like something for you? Having started down it, are you going to stick with it? And they didn't
think so. Like, it was not something for them, or they weren't interested enough.
It was a maturity issue in some cases. It was sometimes pressure to earn sooner.
Okay.
And it was an identity issue. What I'm saying is just like, I just don't think college is for someone like me, which you hear a lot from class.
Right.
You hear it a lot less known race, but you hear it more from men. And so increasingly, what I think young men are just saying, yeah, I get it. I get that it's free, but like, it's not for me. And so the economic question is not the barrier. The barrier to a lot of young men is like, they don't feel ready for it. They don't feel skilled for it. And candidly, also, a lot of them are so sick of education by the time they finish high school that the idea of more of it is not appealing to them. And so those are the issues that were getting in the way, and you don't solve those with money. And so it's a great example of the need to just look through this gender lens, right? If those researchers who'd done that work hadn't actually broken the data down so we could see it for men and women separately, we would never know what we're talking about now. And lots of researchers don't do that. And so what you very often might find that these great results, and the other example I found was Finland, which is in the book, which like Finland is famous for its amazing educational outcomes. But
I've always known that to be true. And you're like, knows that. Not so much with boys.
Not so much with the boys. It's the Finnish girls. They have the biggest gender gap in literacy in the OECD. And so like suddenly you break it by gender and go, wait, what? And that's just really important to know, because if you're a policymaker interested in improving outcomes for everyone, then you should care if it's only helping some people and not others, whichever direction it goes. And so we're kind of almost like burying it by not actually looking through this gender lens.
So if you have a situation like Kalamazoo where, oh my gosh, this amazing policy intervention, you finish K-12, you can go to public college or university for free, folks. And boys are like, no, not really interested. Do you fix that by keeping them back a year? Do you fix that by creating different kinds of higher education opportunities? Like what fixes that?
Yeah, well, that's the question that another program at my institute, the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative, is wrestling with. I think it's a few things. So one is just to recognize that, A, getting the boys to be more ready for college would help. So an extra year, in my view, would help. But a better K-12 system would help. Maybe having more male teachers would make them think, this whole education thing isn't just a thing for girls, right? I mean, my own English teacher helped me get out of remedial English, and it definitely helped that he was a guy. It just did.
Yeah.
Because I was like, men words, cool. So I just think that...
And look where you are today.
Right, and I've written a whole book, Cara.
Yeah.
I mean, Mr. Wyatt is very proud of me.
Right.
Because I was genuinely in remedial English. And so I think that would help. I think more hands-on learning would help. The colleges themselves, when they actually kind of get men coming onto campus, like, they don't keep them. So it's not just that they're less likely to enroll, they're also much less likely to complete. They're 30% more likely to stop out. And if they stop out, they're 30% less likely to come back than women. Right. So every stage of the education pipeline, we're leaking men. Right. It's not just enrollment. Yeah. So colleges themselves, I think, just to be much more intentional about creating peer groups, creating ways to kind of help those men. Every college campus in the US, until recently anyways, had something like a women's resource center to help women make their way through college. But with the exception of 2 that I've been able to find, there isn't a single one that has programming for men. So, but men are the ones who are dropping out in these. So there's something going on with men. And back to this identity point, it turns out a lot of this is just not feeling at home on college campuses as much as women are. And that sounds weird even to say. Just like, that's so odd because it's so recently and there are so many ways we're so used to fighting on behalf of women and kind of women-friendly spaces that even just to say the words that these spaces just don't feel as friendly to the men feels odd, even as I say it. But it seems true. And if it's true, we should do something about it.
To what degree has everything that we've talked about, from K-12 to college to deaths of despair, to what degree do you think that has factored in, if it has, to like the rise of President Trump? I think about 2024, he won men by a whopping 12 points, which is really quite a lot. And I don't know if anything that we've talked about dovetails with his success.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I come at this as a very non-partisan lens, but I think it's quite clear that the many men, especially young men, actually didn't feel like the Democrats or the left generally was really on their side, had their back. And again, I think we've talked a little bit about some of the missed opportunities there, but there was a kind of sense in which that the Democrats and the left were positioning themselves very strongly as the women's party. And meanwhile, the Republicans came along, and I think the signal they sent, especially to young men, not least through podcast appearances and this kind of new media, which is like, yeah, we like men. And it wasn't always very subtle. I mean, Hulk Hogan at the RNC, right? But it did, I think, just what I think happened, honestly, was that the votes of young men especially really came up for grabs in a way that they had not been hitherto. They'd been more reliably on the left. They came up for grabs, and the Republicans grabbed them. And one reason I think they were able to do that was because of this sense of frustration, particularly among young men, which is, what about me?
Yeah.
What about my concerns? What about my issues? And unfortunately, I think that the Democrats put themselves in a position where, in their desire to be so strongly pro-women, they ended up signaling a message that came across as anti-men, or at least didn't have a place for men. I mean, famously, it's famous now at least, like the Democratic Party platform lists who we're for. This is quite, if you go to it's still true today, because who stands for, and it lists various demographic groups that the party stands for, and the only group that it doesn't stand for is men. They're not listed. And I know that people aren't necessarily going to that website and looking at it, but that again is symbolic of the fact, I think, that right now the kind of feel of politics is that the sort of male-friendly side is more on the right, and I think the Republicans were able to seize on that. But I was very struck by how many Democrats were saying in the run-up to the 24 election, why are young men moving towards the right? And I would always correct them and say, are you sure that they're not moving away from the left? It's much easier to say, what is it about the right? Is it Trump? They're all becoming misogynists, which they do not appear to be, right? Their views have not really shifted on policy or politics. Like, are you quite sure that they're not being turned off by you as much as they are being turned on by the Republicans? And that's a much harder conversation to have. I am very pleased that many Democrats, including some we're working with like Wes Moore and Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer, seem to have got the memo that it is a bad idea to only talk about men when you want to give a speech about toxic masculinity.
One of the things we've seen on the right is more of an emphasis recently on sort of traditional family structure, kind of men being the breadwinners, women staying at home, women having more children has been a big emphasis. And I wonder what you think of that, and whether you think, is it indeed going to result in more traditional families? Because obviously that has not been the economic trend of, let's say, the last 50 years, but like, where's that going?
I think the idea of traditional families coming back is going nowhere. There has been, post-pandemic, female labour force participation hit its highest rate on record. There is, we discussed earlier, the lack of representation of women in senior management. But if you look at the lines are going up pretty sharply. I mean, there is no turning back. Even if you wanted to turn back the tide on women's economic progress, there is no way you could do that. And to be clear, I do not want to. I think that the growing economic independence of women is one of the great moral achievements of the last 100 years in advanced economies. That is not going anywhere. So actually one of the pieces of advice I give to young men, if they foolishly ask me for dating advice, is don't wait for a trad wife. You're going to be waiting a long time, right? The only place you'll find a trad wife, this is a woman who's saying she just wants to stay at home and raise kids, is on TikTok. They don't exist in the real world, right? Women want to have a career. They want economic. They want right? And good.
Right.
And we haven't published this work yet. It's a bit of a sneak peek, but we're going to publish some work showing that actually during the pandemic and in the years since, we've seen the biggest increase in the share of amount of time on parenting being done by young fathers. So actually, it's not going to happen. Yeah. It's all mood music, vibes. If we're actually going to increase fertility rates and have more children, I suspect we're going to need more fathering, not more mothering.
Right.
We're going to need help dads to do the work and to do that. And the reason why I think it's not, in a sense, real, if you take somebody like Senator Josh Hawley, who I've had my disagreements with and agreements with, to be fair, like who's in some ways he's become quite an iconic figure. He has his own book, Manhood, and he talks a lot about these traditional roles. Like, I'm like, yeah, but Senator Hawley, your wife is an incredibly successful lawyer arguing cases before the Supreme Court.
Right.
Your wife's not a trad wife. And he's said very clearly he wants his daughters to have the same economic opportunities as his sons. And so, Josh Hawley is not a trad wife kind of guy. And so you think, so if you have, at a certain point, it's just an online meme. And quietly, and in some cases painfully, we're reinventing families so that they can accommodate both gender equality and children. It's a difficult task, but we're trying it.
It actually brings me to, I want to play you a little clip from a conversation I had a couple months ago with Melissa Carney, who the author of a pretty recent book called The Two-Parent Privilege. And she talks about basically richer people getting married at pretty high rates and poorer people getting married at lower rates. And here she is talking about, she has long worked on issues of equity, and here she is talking about the reception to her book. Take a listen.
My book has no, values or culture or promotion kind of like lesson in it. I'm not saying one kind of family, like you have to be this particular model of a family. I am highlighting that a two-parent family in particular is very beneficial. Nonetheless, the message of the book resonated more with folks on the political right, social conservatives. What's I think disappointing about that is progressives who really care about kids and inequality and social mobility, in my view, need to figure out a way to talk about this and accept it as a policy challenge. Because if we don't do something about this, we're going to cement class gaps. So through an equity lens, we would like as a society for more families who are not college educated, who are not white or Asian, we would like them to be able to achieve this.
I wonder what you make of that and how the issue of marriage overlaps with your own work. You were just talking about fatherhood.
Yeah, well, it strongly overlaps with fatherhood because one of the ways in which men are connected to their children, but also to their own economic purpose, is through that providing role. It's just that has to be done in a new way now because they're not going to be the sole providers. And so we are in this period where we're having to kind of recast these traditional ideas of marriage and family for a world in which that's going to be defined differently because of the economic rise of women. And I think the challenge that I'm a huge fan of Melissa's. I'm so glad you had her on. It's a great conversation. I really recommend it to everybody.
She's super.
She's just the best. The challenge is that there's this sort of view on the right that actually, yes, if we want marriage, it's going to have to be defined on these quite traditional lines, right, of the kind of homemaker wife and the breadwinner. Right. They're very comfortable with that. And on the left, it's seen as just, a plot against kind of women. And so actually we shouldn't have any views about family structure. And Melissa was trying to navigate between those two difficult positions, I think. And the reason it matters for men in particular is, as she says in her book and in the conversation you had with her, is that actually, like, if you think about what it means to be a father, it seems to me that that's going to lead us to more marriage and more stable family structures. But as a dad, you have to feel like your role isn't just dependent on the mum. So I think about this in terms of more of a direct relationship between fathers and children. And where Melissa and I strongly agree is with the value of fatherhood. I think that a stronger commitment to fatherhood will lead to more marriage. Not the other way around. And there is no way we know of to kind of create more marriage in order to kind of create more. I don't think you make dads out of husbands. I think you make husbands out of dads. And I do think that that's kind of and right now the political right thinks you make dads out of husbands, and the political left is like, do we need husbands? And as Melissa points out quite bravely, almost all of her critics are married. And actually, the marriage rate among college-educated Americans is incredibly high. And the more affluent they are, the more likely they are to be married. That is not where the marriage problem is happening. And I would just say, like, our work shows quite clearly that when men are doing better economically, the marriage rates are higher. And it's not that women are saying, I want a knight in shining armor who's going to come along and be the breadwinner so I can stay at home. That's not but they are saying, I need a guy who's going to contribute. I need guys with me on in this exercise.
No, that's actually where our conversation started, which is that, like, in the liberal suburbs around Boston and the conservative suburbs around Houston, there's one thing in common. They may not agree on almost any policy issue, but in rich suburbs, almost everybody is married. And, like, why is that? And why do they think about marriage for themselves, but maybe, differ on how it is for other people?
That's exactly right. Yeah, she's done. I mean, for me, I think a lot of that is about parenting. I think a lot of it is because people want to raise their kids together. Melissa's book wasn't necessary reading for most upper middle class Americans, right? They know that two parents are better than one. That's why they're doing it. They're not doing it because the woman is economically is not going to be able to eat unless she marries. They're doing it because they think, they probably want a great marriage and all of that. But they're also, I think, in my own work suggests that it's parenting that's driving it. That actually, I fear I may have even written this publicly, but, like, upper middle class marriage is a joint venture for human capital formation in their children. It's just not very romantic sounding, but I do.
Right. It's the firm.
Yeah, and have you done anything on the rise of grey divorce? Like, people divorce after the kids have left home now?
No, but I've heard of the phenomenon, and I can see where you're going with that.
That's
like, the firm can dissolve once it's accomplished its mission.
The joint venture has created its profit centers, it doesn't need to exist anymore. And none of this is very romantic sounding, but I'm like, I got to tell you, I think that's true. And so that's why I think, actually, in the end, that's how if we are to restore marriage, it is through this commitment to joint parenting.
Right.
I think that's where I land on this, but that's right now a difficult piece of terrain to occupy.
Two final questions for you. First, when you think about, you have thought a lot about solutions to the problems that you have laid out with men and boys. Do you feel like people are listening to you? This could be on a national level, on a state level. Has there been enough of a awakening in your view to be like, oh yeah, this is like a real thing. We should do something about this?
The short answer is yes. I've been really pleasantly surprised by the way the debate has moved on. I mean, it's not to be too autobiographical about this, but I couldn't get anyone to publish the book. Brookings Press picked it up for me. I'm glad. I'll always be grateful to them, but no one else would touch it. It's way too controversial. But I don't think that's so true now. I think that the idea that we can think two thoughts at once, that it's not a zero-sum game, and that it's a bad idea to abandon men, I think that's now much more of a mainstream idea. I think in 2025, 2026, you can talk about these issues without having to apologize quite as much for it, much more so than when the book came out. So I do think, and I think the reason that's happened is because it's true. And people feel it and see it in their own lives, and that there are enough women out there who are saying, look, I want to keep fighting for women, and there's more to do. We've talked about that, but I also want permission to worry about my son and my brother and my husband. I don't have to betray my support for women in order to have those concerns too. And so what I felt really is more of a collective sigh of relief about, actually, it's okay to talk about the problems of men. Hallelujah. Because there are real problems with boys and men. This wouldn't be happening if it wasn't true. And the question is whether we were approaching it in a constructive way or in an embittered way.
Right. Finally, and this is probably something you've thought about before, how would you talk to a 15-year-old boy now about what it means to be like a man in America today?
Well, the first thing I'd just say is, like, you're totally awesome, and we absolutely need you. And because I just think there's so much, like, we need to send many more positive messages to boys and young men. I'd ask them what they like about being a boy, or what they like about being a young man. I'd ask them to name their own role models, and just to be a bit more celebratory about this. I think we've just had this kind of very deficit framed model of, like, we for too long said, like, approach boys with, like, what's wrong with you, rather than, like, what's awesome with you, what's amazing about you, what's right with you. And then what I kind of say is, look, for me, and I've raised 3 boys, they're all in their 20s now, and this has been a journey for me too. I think actually the best definition of what it means to be a man that I've come across in all my work is someone who gives more than they get, who is a contributor. That seems to have been true in pretty much every society we can think of. And think of it that way. Think about, like, when are you giving? And don't think less of yourself. Think of yourself a bit less. And get to a point where actually you're a surplus generator, where actually you're generating more of what the community, family, and tribe needs than you need for your own devices. And so this idea of the kind of Lone Ranger, that being totally self-sufficient, independent thing, is the opposite of masculinity. You'll know you're a man when people count on you, and you know that they can count on you. That's how, and they got to tell you, that is the best feeling in the world. And by the way, women will feel that too. But there might be occasions when it just feels a little bit differently for you. And I think it's even more important that men feel that message. And above all, it's like, we need you. Our country needs you. Your family needs you. Your future family's going to need you. Your colleagues are going to need you. Your friends need you. By God, we need you. Because I just think too many young men have not heard that message about how precious they are in our sight and how badly we need them. So I'd be lifting them up, and I'd say, go out there and contribute to the tribe. The tribe needs you. The tribe welcomes you. Because I think we've lost a little bit of that.
Yeah. Richard Reeves is the author of Boys and Men. He's also the founding president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. Richard, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, anytime, Carl.
And thanks to you for joining us. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more conversations like this one. And if you want to hear that Melissa Carney discussion that we talked about marriage and trends and just how things have changed, which stunned and fascinated me, we have got it for you right here, that video. So take a listen. Thanks so much to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support. Thanks to producer Matt Purdy, and I'll talk to you next time.